Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 587, The All-Seeing Eye, Part 4. On November 11th, 1941, the British political cartoonist Sir David Lowe put out a piece of work. That cartoon, entitled Japan Protests Against Encirclement, shows three figures: the American President Franklin Roosevelt, his Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and the Assistant Secretary of State Sumner Welles, craning their heads behind them to stare at a figure of Japan's then Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, who was running circles around them while complaining that he was being encircled. Lowe, quite obviously, was lampooning the latest news from Asia of the growing crisis in US-Japan relations, with the United States protesting against Japan's aggressive seizures of territory in French Indochina, taking advantage of the collapse of France's government after the German invasion, as well as its ongoing war in China. Tokyo, meanwhile, was constantly issuing declarations to the effect that it was defending itself against the so-called ABCD encirclement or ABCD line, referring to America, Britain, China, and the Dutch, who were the colonial rulers of what is now Indonesia. Lowe, like most non-Japanese observers of the situation in 1941, saw the whole ABCD encirclement narrative as kind of ridiculous, as his cartoon makes very clear. The idea that Japan was somehow under attack when Japan's government was literally the one prosecuting a, by this point, 4-year-long war in China under the most brutal conditions imaginable, while simultaneously taking advantage of the weakness of French rule in Asia to grab yet more land and prosecute that war even further, the idea that somehow in all of that Japan was the victim of aggression just seems insane on its face. And doubtless, Sir David Lowe, like many other observers, including probably President Roosevelt, Secretary of State Hull, and Assistant Secretary of State Welles, thought all of this yelling about encirclement was obviously a farce. It's just a self-serving narrative intended by the Japanese government for its own propaganda to put a better face on its actions. Nobody, in other words, could be that high on their own supply, so to speak, to actually believe that Japan was the victim here, right? Except, well, there probably were a few cynics among the leadership in Tokyo who just parroted the lines they were expected to read, because that's just politics, baby. But the evidence we have available suggests that, in point of fact, most of the leaders of wartime Japan really did see themselves as on the defensive, as genuinely subject to some sort of secret plot by Western powers to undermine them. For example, by conspiring to cut off fuel supplies for the Japanese military, one of the many sanctions ordered by the American government in the summer of 1941 in response to Japanese actions. Just to look at one example of this sincerity of belief in a Western conspiracy, Prime Minister Tojo Hideki ultimately, of course, did okay a pretty desperate plan cooked up by the Imperial Japanese Navy during this time to launch an all-out assault on Dutch-controlled Indonesia to seize the fuel necessary to maintain Japan's war machine. That fuel was being denied to Japan, so the thinking went, as part of the encirclement conspiracy which was aiming to destroy the empire Japan had built. And since the Dutch were conspiring with the British and the Americans, this also meant Japan had to go after British positions in Malaya and Singapore and American ones in the Philippines, and of course attempt to take out as much of the American Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii as possible. Pretty much everyone involved in this plan, including the guy who cooked it up, Japan's foremost fleet admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, acknowledged pretty openly that it was not a good plan. The odds of complete success using what was ultimately a pretty half-baked rehash of the exact same war plan Japan had used at the opening of the Russo-Japanese War 35-ish years earlier, which even then hadn't fully succeeded against an imperial Russian government that was, by any metric, a lot weaker than the United States alone, not to mention all the allies put together, well, they simply weren't very good. Tojo, however, responded to any and all objections about the potential for failure with a sort of fatalistic resignation, telling one of his underlings that, quote, sometimes you just have to jump off the veranda at Kiyomizu, which is a reference to an old legend about Kyoto's Kiyomizu-dera that if you jumped off the temple's 13 meters / 42.6 foot high veranda and didn't die, you would be blessed with good fortune. Good fortune that, one imagines, you would use up immediately by not dying, but I digress. Now, I put it to you, my dear listeners, that any politician would have to be absolutely insane to make decisions with that kind of mindset. It is an unhinged way to think about politics, unless, of course, you genuinely believe you have to take this risk because you are under attack by an all-powerful conspiracy that all of your neighbors are in on. Put another way, the decision to go ahead with the Pearl Harbor attack basically only makes sense if you accept the basic premise of conspiratorial encirclement. This is a pretty clear example of conspiracist thinking, and I am not the only one who thinks so. A few decades back, Peter Deuce, one of the big names in the study of Imperial Japan, wrote a short little essay called The Paranoid Style in Japanese Foreign Policy. That name is a reference to one of the more famous works of conspiracism alongside Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, which we referenced back in the first episode of this series, the American historian Richard Hofstadter's essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. Hofstadter, who was writing in 1964, was focused primarily on the John Birch Society and its anti-communist paranoia, and how that reflected a longer, anti-intellectual, and conspiratorial mindset in American politics, which he called the paranoid style. I'm going to go back to Peter Deuce's essay on the paranoid style and quote a chunk at length. Quote, Hofstadter used the term paranoid style to describe the heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy that had characterized right-wing political movements in the United States from the early 19th century onward. He was not using the term in a clinical sense, but was trying to evoke a way of viewing the world, marked, as true paranoia was, by a sense of persecution and delusions of grandeur. His point was that paranoid modes of expression could also be deployed by more or less normal people. To be sure, he added, paranoid visions were not conjured out of thin air. There was always plausible evidence to support the anxieties they revealed. What characterized the paranoid style was not the absence of verifiable facts, but a curious leap in imagination that is always made at some critical point in the recital of events. Nor were paranoid visions lacking in coherence or logic. Indeed, the opposite was true. Often they seemed to make more rational sense than the real world did, though invariably they wove the verifiable facts into a neatly patterned fabric of fear, threat, and evil. It is clear that many Japanese high and low cleaved to a paranoid style of thinking in 1941, but unlike the American right wing, which traditionally feared the enemy within, whether Freemasons, Catholics, Jewish capitalists, or communists, the Japanese saw only enemies without. And they saw a conspiracy directed not simply at Japan, but the whole of East Asia, or at least at the new Asia they were now building, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. I think Peter Deuce is bang on in this essay, but I would add the extra layer, and that's what this week's episode is all about, that this paranoid mindset is a continuation in many ways of the conspiracism around Christianity that existed during the rule of the Tokugawa shoguns. In much the same way, to borrow Peter Deuce's phrasing, that there was a curious leap in imagination from the verifiable fact that Catholicism did have an uncomfortable relationship with European imperial expansion, to the idea that Catholics were all magic evil wizards, part of a knowing conspiracy to destroy the land of the gods. There's also a clear leap from the idea of a latent hostility to Japan among many of the Western powers, to the idea that those Western powers were knowingly conspiring against Japan. So let's talk about how we get from point A to point B, from the Osaka incident of 1827 to Pearl Harbor 114 years later. In 1868, when the feudal system in Japan finally came crumbling down, paranoia around Christianity was still at a fever pitch, sparked in many ways by the discovery that despite all efforts to eradicate the evil religion, pockets of believers had managed to survive in the isolated parts of Kyushu, revealing themselves to European Catholics once the gunpoint diplomacy of the West had forced Japan's ports open. Indeed, it's worth noting that after the downfall of the Tokugawa shoguns in 1868, one of the first official edicts of the new imperial regime in April 1868, that's before even what's now Tokyo had fallen to the imperial government, was to reiterate that, quote, the Christian and other evil religions are strictly prohibited. This is pretty remarkable and a clear indicator of how deep paranoia around Christianity ran among the elite of this time. This was a regime that was willing to compromise ultimately on basically everything else, from, say, allowing foreigners into the presence of the emperor, unheard of in past centuries, to reigning in the independence of the feudal domains, to a host of other reforms, from conscription to centralization to westernization. By contrast, it took 5 years until 1873 for the new government to finally formally abandon the anti-Christian laws, and only then because foreign governments had made it very clear they would never view Japan as an equal if the country did not legalize quote-unquote religious toleration, by which they pretty explicitly meant the toleration of Christianity. And so the new government did become more tolerant of Christians, and when Imperial Japan finally got its written constitution in 1889, Article 28 of said constitution did explicitly state that all subjects had freedom of religion, though it was careful to note that said freedom should exist, quote, within limits not prejudicial to peace and order, and not antagonistic to their duties as subjects. Caveats like this, not to mention 300 years of social propaganda at this point, meant that while Christianity was legally tolerated in Imperial Japan, it was never free of stigma, and particularly during the run-up to the Second World War, it came in for substantial scrutiny by the military government. We did a whole multi-part series on the history of Christianity in Japan, starting with episode 349, so I don't want to rehash too much of that here. What I want to note instead is that the conspiracist mindset around Christianity, much like prejudice against the religion, didn't vanish overnight. Instead, the paranoid style that came into vogue was one that saw the threat shift, not Christianity, but the West itself. We can see a start in that shift actually as far back as our previous episode 2 weeks ago in the writings of Aizawa Seishisai, who we talked about with his Shinron, his new theses, written in 1825. He was very focused on the threat of Christianity, but not for its own sake, as a tool of Western conquest. That theme was picked up by the samurai intellectual Yoshida Shoin, who actually managed to get himself executed by the Tokugawa shogunate in 1859 for planning to assassinate a senior official. But before that time, he had been the tutor of 3 kids who would go on to be pretty important in the new imperial regime: Yamagata Aritomo, the father of the Japanese army, Inoue Kaoru, one of the early regime's most important diplomats, and Ito Hirobumi, the author of the new constitution. Yoshida had a love-hate relationship with the West. His first run-in with the laws of the shogunate came when he actually tried to sneak aboard one of Commodore Perry's ships to go learn the ways of the West and bring them back to Japan. He was put under house arrest because he did that, which is why he had the time to become a teacher. But in his 1858 essay Kyofu no Gen, or The Diary of a Madman, Yoshida laid out what could be called the argument of the shift towards anti-Western conspiracism, the basis from which all further paranoid thinking about the West grew. At the time Yoshida was writing, the major issue of the day was the negotiation of the so-called Harris Treaty, named for the American consul general in Japan, Townsend Harris, and one of the most important of the so-called unequal treaties that bound Japan into a legally subordinate position in its foreign relations for decades. The Harris Treaty, in a word, was obviously not great, and Yoshida, along with many others, could recognize very clearly the Americans were using their advantage in military might and technology to force concessions out of Japan for their own benefit. But Yoshida took this basis and made what Richard Hofstadter would definitely describe as, quote, a curious leap in imagination that is always made at some critical point in the recital of events. In this case, the curious leap was the laying out of a conspiracy that the Americans were actually secretly planning to interfere in the selection of Japan's next shogun, putting their preferred candidate on the throne, that they were going to use the leverage of the Harris Treaty to literally buy up some of the islands of Japan and use these as a base for an invasion, and that the foolish and weak-minded commoners of Japan would be subverted by American poorhouses and orphanages, that American charities would turn locals into a fifth column that would welcome American invaders within a few years. Now, from a modern perspective, frankly, this all sounds absolutely banana pants crazy. There was never any plan like this. Indeed, from the perspective of a 19th century imperialist, directly conquering territories was usually a waste of time. It was a lot easier to subvert the local government to your whims and get them to do what you wanted. More importantly, Yoshida's whole argument fits our definition of a conspiracy theory very well. It's absolutely intentionalist. This American master plan is not, say, a response to systemic pressure that incentivized America to compete with Europe to set up its own empire, or to try and distract its domestic population from internal tensions around slavery with big foreign policy wins. No, this was a carefully thought out master plan cooked up by people like Harris with a clear end goal. The American goals were based on pure vice and avarice, greed, absolutely antithetical, in Yoshida's view, to pure Confucian gentlemanly virtue, and as such so dangerous that, to use his words, quote, "The ancients had a saying, if a poisonous viper bites his hand, even the bravest man will quickly cut off his arm." There was no sacrifice too great to stop the evil plan from coming to fruition. And finally, in Yoshida's eyes, everything the Westerners did was a sign of their evil intentions. Even their claims of Christian charity were in fact symbolic of their plan to subvert Japan to their whim by brainwashing its masses. And Yoshida Shoin was not the only one who felt this way. Such assumptions about how Western diplomacy worked permeated down to the level of popular culture. For example, here are the lyrics of a popular song translated by the British diplomat Sir George Bailey Sansom, which he overheard shortly after coming to Japan in 1904, and which his Japanese friends had told him had been around since the 1880s. Quote, "In the west there is England, in the north Russia. My countrymen, be careful. Outwardly they make treaties, but you cannot tell what is at the bottom of their hearts. There is a law of nations, it is true, but when the moment comes, remember, the strong eat up the weak." This understanding of the West, that it was a land, to use a somewhat metaphorical flourish, of circling sharks constantly waiting to pounce the moment they smelled blood in the proverbial water, was very popular among many, particularly in the emergent Japanese middle class, and in many ways, the popular opposition to the Meiji government was actually more hostile and anti-Western than the actual government of the Meiji Emperor itself. For example, the Freedom and People's Rights movement was the first organized political opposition to the new imperial government that didn't take the form of a bunch of angry samurai who were mad about having to cut their hair, not wear swords in public, and actually work for a living. It was a political movement of lower samurai and townsmen interested broadly in a more liberal series of political reforms, along the lines, depending on who you asked, of either France or the United Kingdom, to create a more genuinely participatory Japanese government. The various branches of the movement would provide the nucleus for Japan's first opposition political parties. Today, basically all lowercase l liberal politics in Japan, in other words, parties that are not either monarchist or socialist/communist, the ones that are broadly pro-market and pro-democracy, are descended ideologically and in some cases very directly from the Freedom and People's Rights movement. And yet, even in this movement, there was a lot of suspicion about the West, and I mean, how could there not be? Sometimes that opposition would manifest in some very unusual ways. In 1885, government authorities in Osaka busted up a plot by Freedom and People's Rights extremists to smuggle weapons into Korea and foment a revolution against the peninsula's monarchy, with the aim of then using Korea as a base to overthrow the Japanese government and unite the two countries in a sort of Asian liberal union against Western imperialism. As Oi Kentaro, one of the ringleaders of this whole conspiracy, put it during his very unrepentant testimony during his trial, the plan was undertaken, quote, for the sake of Japan but out of goodwill in the fashion of global brotherhood. One of his co-conspirators agreed, later testifying that the plan, quote, should not be seen as Japan interfering in Korea. He went on to add later, quote, if you want to talk about our position in Asia, I need to reiterate that we weren't using Korea as bait to be sacrificed, but we're trying to bring about a revolution there as a way to improve the situations in Japan and China as well, in other words, throughout all of Asia. Moreover, this should be seen as part of our larger strategy of Asia opposing Europe. That same perpetrator would go on to say, quote, we are all opposed to the contemporary notion of the strong devour the weak, as those are the kinds of ideas emanating from a truly barbarian world. Now, I do want to note that this plan is about as half-baked as it is possible for a plan to be. The plotters don't even seem to have agreed amongst themselves on whether they actually had a shot of overthrowing the Korean government. They did have some pro-Japanese supporters within that government, but not many. Or if the goal was just to foment a Korea-Japan war that would lead to protest and ideally revolution in both countries. But the plan itself does show the extent to which a paranoid mindset about the West had infiltrated itself into Japanese politics, such that this sort of absolutely crazy idea was the only way you could stop it. Now, I do want to stop here and answer a question I imagine a few of you are asking in some form or another. Isn't it not paranoia if they're actually out to get you? Put another way, we think of conspiracism as something that is wholly invented, the crazy guy with the tinfoil hat yelling about how they're turning the frogs gay, not to name any names. But while the solutions might be a bit, let's call them unorthodox, weren't the members of the Freedom and People's Rights movement, the singers of that popular song, hell, even Yoshida Shoin, correct in perceiving that there was a conspiracy against their country on the part of Western colonialists who were in fact out to subjugate Japan, even if, in places, the actual narratives invented by these Japanese thinkers carried things a bit too far? Well, in one sense, yes, the threat here is not entirely invented, but I would also point out that there is often at least something to any conspiracy theory, and no, guys, don't worry, I promise I'm not about to go off the deep end and tell you that the 5G in your phones is mind controlling you on behalf of George Soros or anything. But here's the thing. While it was totally fanciful to say that Christians were all secret wizards using their magic to undermine Japan, there was a kernel of truth. The church did act as a vanguard of empire for Catholic powers in the 1500s, and certainly Jesuits in Japan did not show a lot of regard for native institutions in their pursuit of power in Kyushu. We have to remember here what Richard Hofstadter says in The Paranoid Style in American Politics about that curious leap of imagination. Hofstadter's essay, at its core, is about the John Birch Society, and I think it is reasonable to say in 1964 that, as many Birchers believed, Soviet-style communism was in fact hostile to the United States as a whole. You might remember that whole Cold War thing. But Hofstadter was also right to point out that there is a big jump from that assertion to what the Birchers believed about Soviet communist agents having infiltrated every level of society and government, all the way to President Eisenhower being a communist. That's the paranoid leap of the Birchers. That's what moves them into conspiracism. Similarly, Japanese people who were suspicious of the West in the late 1800s, early 1900s, inarguably right to be so. This was the age of colonialism, the age of forced opening of Japan and other countries to Western trade, the unequal treaties, all of that, and indeed the diplomatic statements of the Western powers themselves made it very clear they did not see Japan, at least initially, as a country equal to their own. The singers of that folk song from 1880 were absolutely right to warn their listeners to remember that the strong eat up the weak. But it's when we get into the whys and hows that we see our curious leap. What actually motivated colonialism and Western expansion in Asia? Certainly there were a few mustachio-twirling villains who were just terrible people looking to line their pockets, but I think it's pretty inarguable that for the most part what we're looking at here are systemic factors that drove colonial policy. It's a generation of politicians who, even if they wouldn't admit it, had been raised to view politics through the 2,400-year-old lens of the Greek historian Thucydides, who in his Melian dialogue in the history of the Peloponnesian War has his Athenian diplomats say to his weaker foes that, quote, "We shall not trouble you with specious pretenses, since you know as well as we do that the right, as the world goes, is only in question between equal power, while the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." It's the systemic factors of unfettered capitalism demanding more and more access to more and more raw materials for cheaper and cheaper, and captive markets to sell finished products to. It's the constant need for competition against each other. Remember, what drove the speed of Commodore Perry's expedition and his return to Japan in 1854, the signing of the Harris Treaty in 1858, was a worry that the British or the Russians might beat the Americans to the punch and force Japan to sign an unequal treaty first. It's of course driven by a dose of racist thinking, operating from the assumption that non-white cultures are just inherently inferior. But these are all systemic problems. They are caused by long-standing social arrangements of power and privilege, not one choice made by one person or a group of people. They are not the result of a conspiracy, but almost the opposite. Nobody was really controlling a conspiracy of Western colonialism. The whole system was driven by systemic incentives in a race to the bottom. To put it simply, I'm not saying the Western powers treated Japan fairly. I am saying that unfairness was not a result of them getting together behind closed doors and deliberately deciding to do this. It was not a grand conspiracy. Now, there were, of course, moments where Western powers did work together to stymie Japanese interests. Of course, after the victory over China in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, Japan was forced to hand back part of the territory it seized from China, the Liaodong Peninsula, when Imperial Russia stepped in to make them do so with the backing of Germany and France. Similarly, in 1919, after World War I, Japan stood as one of the victorious Allied powers at the Versailles Peace Conference, but its efforts to insert a racial equality clause into the covenant of the new League of Nations, not out of generosity, by the way, just a desire to establish Japan's equality with the West, those were blocked by some backroom wheeling and dealing of Commonwealth powers, most notably South Africa and Australia. In a sense, of course, these were conspiracies, deals struck behind closed doors to advance a political agenda, but they were not secret. The dealings in question were pretty open. These were individual, discrete conspiracies of geopolitics, not a calculated master plan. Yet, particularly on the right wing of Japanese politics by the early 20th century, the constant sense of being unfairly handled inflamed a growing sense of anti-Western nationalism, one that often verged into conspiracy. The classic example is the liberal journalist Tokutomi Soho, a journalist and active campaigner for democratic liberalism in Japan who was so infuriated when Japan was made to give the Liaodong Peninsula back to China in 1895 by what he saw as racist European cynicism that he more or less reversed his entire political worldview over a couple months and became an authoritarian nationalist. He would remain such for the remainder of his life, becoming an anti-Western, pro-imperialism pundit, and for example argued that Japan's alliance with the UK, which it signed in 1902, was actually useless. The British only saw Japan as a means to, quote, protect her rights and interests that she has acquired. Tokutomi also despised the United States, arguing that the facade of liberalism put forward by presidents like Woodrow Wilson with his talk of disarmament and arms limitation, respect for sovereignty, all of that, was just a guise to weaken Japan in particular, because, quote, America in the Far East intends to acquire rights and interests, and for that reason looks at Japan as a rival. Tokutomi was, of course, critical of the failure of the racial equality clause, but was most angry about the arms limitations treaties that the US and United Kingdom convinced Japan to sign on to in the 1920s. When news broke on July 1st, 1924 that Japan had agreed to the Washington Naval Treaty, which gave Japan a smaller overall fleet than what the US and UK were allowed to build, Tokutomi ran a front-page article in his paper, the Kokumin Shimbun, calling it National Humiliation Day. He would repeatedly argue throughout the 20s and 30s that the US and UK were fundamentally out to destroy Japan's empire, that the war between these powers was inevitable, and he ended up as a close advisor of future Prime Minister Tojo Hideki and other senior militarists in the wartime government. Similarly, Kita Iki, the intellectual father of Japanese fascism, whose outline of a plan for the reorganization of Japan is kind of the baseline text of 1920s and 1930s Japanese extreme right-wing politics. Literally, the whole text begins with the claim that, quote, "Abroad, be it Britain, the United States, Germany, Russia, there is not a single power that has not violated its word. Even our neighbor China, to whom we have provided protection since the Russo-Japanese War, has rewarded us only with contempt. Truly, we are a small island isolated in the Eastern Sea. There is a danger that the country established by our ancestors will disappear if we make one miscalculation, for we see again the danger of internal troubles and foreign danger our country faced at the end of the Tokugawa period and the Meiji Restoration." I want to note once again that both Tokutomi Soho and Kita Iki described their conspiracist view of the West as defensive, by which I mean the conspiracy was one of aggression against Japan that Japan's empire was intended to defend against. It was not that the Western powers were trembling with fear in the face of the rising tide of Japan, but that Japan itself was outgunned and surrounded by a hostile world. That framing serves a key purpose. To return to Peter Deuce's essay on the paranoid style in Japan, quote, "The vision of encirclement allowed the Japanese to portray themselves as victims rather than victimizers, and this of course had several consequences. First, the portrayal of Japan as threatened rather than threatening made it easier to mobilize public anxiety over the looming crisis. By eroding any sense of complacence, the vision of encirclement put the public on notice that a potentially overwhelming confrontation with the ABCD allies had to be met by more than ordinary efforts. Second, the portrayal of Japan as victim allowed the Japanese to bond with their own victims. If the Japanese were the objects of conspiracies by white imperialists or Anglo-Saxon imperialists, just as the Chinese and their other Asian neighbors were, then it was possible to transform Japan's aggression into an act of mutual self-defense. By 1941, the notion that Japan was fighting a war for the liberation of Asia was firmly fixed in the public consciousness, and so was the notion that Japan was a have-not nation seeking to overthrow an international order dominated by the haves. Now, this worldview was popularized on the extreme right of Japanese politics by men like Tokutomi Soho and Kita Iki, and then over the course of the 1920s, became more and more a part of the political discourse of Japan in general. As the Japan-UK alliance fell apart, as the UK started to drift closer to the United States, as Japan signed more and more arms limitation treaties keeping its own fleets smaller than those of the other Western powers, this worldview became more and more popular, and then of course, in 1929 you have the Great Depression, and the West battening down its economic hatches, throwing Japan's economy into a tumble as international trade plummeted. And then in 1931, you have the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the condemnations in the League of Nations, and all of this rhetoric goes mainstream. Already by the mid-1920s, you had political pundits predicting an inevitable crisis between Japan and the US that would happen in the mid-30s, triggered by, in their view, Western aggression. Growing Chinese nationalism was spun not as a natural result of Japan's very unfair treatment of China on the political stage, but as a conspiracy against Japan's natural leadership of Asia, the British and the Americans, and as time went on, the Soviet Union, stoking resentment among the Chinese to steal their support. So in other words, it's not like Tojo and other Japanese wartime leaders during World War II invented all of this narrative from whole cloth. The idea that Japan was under siege by hostile powers had been a part of public discourse going back to the start of the Meiji period, and again, there was a kernel of truth there, but that kernel was based more on the structural nature of geopolitics, the racist assumptions of political leaders, in the case of China, by Japan's own foolish behavior towards its neighbor, and by the fact that Japan just was not strong enough militarily or economically to defeat the biggest Western powers, the UK and the US. None of this was the result of a deliberate conspiracy, but of course it's hard to rally the troops if you admit that. The claim of the American, British, Chinese, Dutch encirclement had become a conspiracist movement. It was intentionalist, believing there was a plot by the Western powers. Dualist, the stakes were the very survival of Asia against Westerners looking to destroy it, and symbolic. Every treaty, every agreement between the British and the Americans, every petty slight was proof of the grand conspiracy rather than, just the inherent cruelty of geopolitics. And of course, this conspiracism has consequences. Looking at Japan's planning for the Second World War, at the execution of its strategies right down to the very final moments, the thing that stands out to me, at least, is how wildly unrealistic all of it was. The conspiracist belief in the ABCD encirclement became self-reinforcing. The American and British agreement known as the Atlantic Charter, the American support for the Lend-Lease program in the UK even before the formal entry into World War II, were proof of a US-UK alliance for world domination and not, justifiable concern about the Nazis. Japan's own alliance with Nazi Germany was sold as a way to break encirclement. Instead, it became an albatross around Japan's neck, tying the country to an unpredictable ally at best, one that was increasingly unpopular with Japan's most direct military rivals, who otherwise probably would have cared a lot more about what was happening in Europe than what was happening in Asia. When the British and Dutch, concerned about Japan's seizure of French colonies in Asia after the fall of France to the Nazis, had a little planning summit about the possibility of war in Asia in the summer of 1941, that was just proof that they'd been in it together the whole time. The best thing you can say about Pearl Harbor as a plan was that it was a big gamble, and even the people who came up with it admitted that. Japan's China strategy, inasmuch as there was one, proceeded entirely from a conspiracist notion that Chinese nationalism and anti-Japanese sentiment wasn't even real, it was being stoked from the outside, and thus prevented any realistic assessment of the fact that Japanese strategies just were not working. The list goes on all the way to 1945 and the very end of World War II, when the belief in Tokyo that Russia was not a part of the encirclement and would thus help Japan negotiate a more favorable end to World War II caused the war to drag on for months and get hundreds of thousands of people killed in the process. This is one of the biggest dangers of conspiracism. It prevents us from clearly seeing what the root of the issue actually is. Again, Japanese leaders weren't wrong to perceive hostility from the other great powers, but the vision of ABCD encirclement led them to understand where it was coming from, and thus what to do about it, in a deeply wrong-headed way, and many, many others would pay the price for that. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com, and you can support us on Patreon. Special thanks to new patrons Brian and Mark for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the 5th and final part of this mini-series.